The apartment felt wrong when I walked in at 11:30 that Tuesday night. Not wrong like someone had broken in, wrong like someone had made themselves too comfortable. My girlfriend Hazel sat on our couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, typing with the kind of focus she usually reserved for her clinical research reports. She didn't look up when I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. "How was the conference?" she asked, still staring at her screen. "Productive." I loosened my tie and studied her profile. Something about her posture seemed rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this casual scene. Landed 2 new consulting contracts with pharmaceutical companies in Portland. That got her attention. Her fingers paused over the keyboard, and she glanced at me with what looked like genuine interest mixed with something else. Relief, maybe. "That's great, Rylan. Really great." She closed the laptop and set it aside. "Actually, I need to talk to you about something." I'd heard those words before, usually followed by news about unexpected expenses or changes to our weekend plans. But tonight, her voice carried a different weight. I grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator and leaned against the counter, waiting. "My ex-boyfriend Damon is in town," she said, watching my face for a reaction. "He's going through a rough patch and needs somewhere to stay for a few weeks. I told him he could crash here." The water bottle crinkled in my grip. "Your ex-boyfriend?" "It's not like that, Rylan. He's just a friend now. He helped me through some difficult times before we met, and I owe him this much." She stood up, smoothing down her blouse. "I need you to be mature about this." I took a slow sip of water, buying time to process what she'd just said. Hazel and I had been together for 2 years, living in this apartment for 8 months. She'd mentioned Damon exactly twice in all that time, both times dismissing him as ancient history when I'd asked about her previous relationships. "When does he arrive?" I asked. "Tomorrow afternoon. He's driving up from Florida." She moved closer, reaching for my hand. "I know it's awkward, but it's temporary. A month at most." I looked down at her fingers intertwined with mine. Her engagement ring, the one I'd given her 6 months ago, caught the light from the kitchen fixture. The diamond was modest, but I'd saved for 8 months to buy it. She'd cried when I proposed, telling me it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Where's he planning to sleep?" I asked. "The couch converts to a bed. He won't be in our way." Our way. The phrase sat wrong in my stomach. This was my apartment, inherited from my mother's estate when she passed 3 years ago. Hazel had moved in when her lease expired, contributing to groceries and utilities, but never rent. Not that I'd asked her to. I made good money as a pharmaceutical engineering consultant, and I'd wanted her to feel welcome in what I'd hoped would become our permanent home. "What kind of rough patch?" I asked. She hesitated, and in that pause, I caught something flickering across her face. "Financial stuff. Job troubles. You know how the economy is." I nodded slowly. "Sure, I understand." The relief that washed over her features was immediate and telling. She'd expected a fight, maybe even hoped for one. Instead, I smiled and kissed her forehead. "I'll pick up some extra groceries tomorrow," I said. "Make sure we have enough food for 3 people." "Really? You're okay with this?" "Of course. You're right. I should be mature about it." I finished my water and tossed the bottle in the recycling bin. "I'm going to grab a shower and get some work done. Big presentation next week." I headed toward the bedroom, leaving her standing in the kitchen with that same expression of relief mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. As I gathered my clothes for the shower, I heard her laptop open again and the soft clicking of keys resuming. In the bathroom, I turned on the water and let it run hot while I stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from too many late nights reviewing pharmaceutical trial data and not enough sleep. At 34, I was starting to show the wear of a decade spent building a consulting business from nothing. My mother had always said I had my father's stubborn streak and her analytical mind. Both traits had served me well in my career. But tonight, they were telling me something was very wrong with Hazel's story. I'd been traveling for work more frequently over the past few months, and each time I returned, small things had changed. Her phone habits, for one. She used to leave it on the counter while she cooked or watched television. Now it stayed glued to her side, face down, with notifications silenced. Her work schedule had become erratic too. Late nights at the clinical research firm, weekend emergency meetings, sudden business trips that she'd mention only in passing. The shower steam fogged the mirror, erasing my reflection. I stepped under the hot water and let it wash away the day's travel fatigue while my mind worked through the logistics of what Hazel had just proposed. A month-long visit from an ex-boyfriend who needed financial help. No advance notice, no discussion, just a fait accompli presented as a favor to an old friend. My phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. I reached through the shower curtain and grabbed it, wiping water from the screen. A text from Grant Solon, my lawyer and college roommate. "How was the conference? Still on for drinks Thursday?" I typed back quickly. "Conference was good. Can we move drinks to tomorrow night? Something came up." His response was immediate. "Everything okay?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, water dripping from my hair onto the phone. Grant had handled my mother's estate, my business contracts, and every legal matter I'd encountered for the past decade. He was also the most paranoid person I knew, a trait that had saved me from several bad business deals over the years. "Probably nothing," I typed. "Just want to run something by you." "My office at 7? Perfect." I finished my shower and dried off, listening to Hazel moving around the apartment. Her laptop closed again, followed by the sound of her brushing her teeth in the guest bathroom. By the time I emerged from the master bathroom, she was already in bed, curled on her side with her back to my half of the mattress. "Good night," I said, sliding under the covers. "Good night," she murmured, but her breathing was too controlled, too measured. She was awake, thinking about tomorrow and whatever complications Damon's arrival might bring. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around us. The apartment had been my sanctuary for 3 years, the place where I'd rebuilt my life after my mother's passing and established my consulting business. Every room held memories of late nights spent developing proposals, early mornings reviewing trial data, quiet weekends when Hazel would read on the couch while I worked at the kitchen table. Now a stranger was going to sleep on my couch for a month, and my fiancée had made that decision without consulting me. I reached for my phone and opened my notes app, typing in the darkness. Damon, ex-boyfriend from Florida, financial troubles, job issues, arriving tomorrow afternoon, staying 1 month, Hazel nervous about my reaction. No prior discussion. The notes felt clinical, like the pharmaceutical trial summaries I reviewed for work, but they helped organize my thoughts and identify the gaps in information. Where exactly in Florida? What kind of job troubles? How had he contacted Hazel and when? Why now and why here? My mother had always told me that the best way to solve any problem was to gather complete information before taking action. Measure twice, cut once, she'd say, whether she was talking about her sewing projects or my college course selection. The advice had served me well in business, where rushing into partnerships or contracts without proper due diligence could cost thousands of dollars and months of wasted effort. Tomorrow, I'd start measuring. I woke up at 6:30 to find Hazel already gone. Her side of the bed was cold, and I could hear the shower running in the guest bathroom. She usually left for work around 8, which meant she was either getting an early start or avoiding conversation about yesterday's announcement. I made coffee and checked my email while the apartment filled with the sounds of her morning routine. 3 new project inquiries, a contract revision from a client in Seattle, and a reminder about next week's presentation to a pharmaceutical company in Boston. Normal work stuff that felt strangely comforting after last night's conversation. Hazel emerged from the bedroom at 7:15, dressed in her usual work attire, dark slacks, white blouse, and the small gold necklace I'd given her for her birthday. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, grabbing a banana and her travel mug. "I'll be late tonight," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We're starting a new trial protocol, and there's a lot of setup work." "What kind of trial?" I asked. She paused with her hand on the door handle. "Cardiac medication, phase 2 testing." Her voice had the flat tone she used when discussing work details she couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on. Damon should be here around 4. I gave him my spare key. The key she'd never offered to give me, even after I'd suggested we exchange spares for emergencies. I nodded and took another sip of coffee. "I'll be here to let him in," I said. "Working from home today anyway." "Thanks. I really appreciate this, Rylan." After she left, I sat in the quiet apartment and opened my laptop. First order of business, call Grant and confirm our meeting. Second, start gathering information about Hazel's mysterious ex-boyfriend. Grant answered on the second ring. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Still good for tonight?" "Absolutely. What's got you worried?" I summarized Hazel's announcement, keeping my tone neutral and factual. Grant listened without interrupting, a habit he'd developed during his years as a corporate attorney. "Interesting timing," he said when I finished. "How long since you've seen her ex?" "Never met him. She's barely mentioned him in 2 years." "And he's staying how long?" "A month, according to Hazel." Grant was quiet for a moment. I could hear him typing in the background, probably taking notes. "Want me to run a background check?" The question hung in the air between us. Running a background check on my fiancée's ex-boyfriend felt like crossing a line, the kind of paranoid behavior that could damage trust in a relationship. But the analytical part of my mind, the part that had built my consulting business by identifying potential problems before they became actual problems, was already nodding. "Just basic stuff," I said. "Public records, employment history, nothing invasive." "I'll have something by tonight." "What's his full name?" I realized I didn't know. "Damon something. Last name starts with V, I think. She mentioned it once." I felt foolish admitting how little I knew about someone who was apparently important enough in Hazel's life to warrant a month-long stay in our apartment. "I'll work with what I have. See you at 7. After hanging up, I spent the morning working on client projects and trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Around noon, I took a break to walk through the apartment and really look at the space Damon would be occupying. The living room was open and comfortable, with large windows facing east toward the harbor. The couch was a sectional I'd bought after moving in, expensive enough to convert into a decent bed, but not something I'd want to sleep on for a month. The coffee table held Hazel's medical journals and a few of my engineering magazines. Everything looked normal, domestic, settled, but as I stood there, I noticed things I'd missed before. Hazel's laptop bag sat by the front door, positioned so she could grab it quickly on her way out. Her medical textbooks were stacked on the bookshelf in a specific order, spines aligned with military precision. Even her coffee mug from this morning had been rinsed and placed in the dishwasher before she left, despite her usual habit of leaving dishes in the sink. She was nervous about something, and it wasn't just my reaction to Damon's visit. At 3:30, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our door. They paused, and I caught the soft sound of someone checking door numbers. A key turned in the lock, and I looked up from my laptop as the door opened. Damon Vossel was not what I'd expected. He was tall and lean, probably my age, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested either vanity or professional necessity. His clothes were expensive: designer jeans, leather jacket, shoes that cost more than most people spent on a week's groceries. He carried a single duffel bag and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being welcome wherever he went. "You must be Rylan," he said, extending his hand. "Damon Vossel. Thanks for letting me crash here." His grip was firm, his smile practiced. Up close, I could see the subtle signs of stress around his eyes, the kind of tension that comes from sustained pressure rather than temporary inconvenience. "No problem," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "Hazel said you're going through a rough patch." "Career transition," he said, setting his bag down and looking around the apartment. "Sometimes you have to take a step back to move forward, you know?" I nodded, as if I understood, watching him catalog the space with quick, assessing glances. His attention lingered on the expensive electronics, the artwork Hazel had chosen, the general comfort level of the furnishings. "Nice place," he said. Hazel always had good taste. The comment felt loaded, like he was establishing some kind of historical claim to my fiancé's preferences. I kept my expression neutral. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, water?" "Water would be great." I moved to the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. From the refrigerator, I could see Damon examining the photographs on our mantel, pictures of Hazel and me at various events, vacation shots, the engagement photo we'd had taken at the harbor. "How long have you two been together?" he asked, picking up the engagement photo. 2 years. We got engaged 6 months ago." "Congratulations." He set the photo down carefully, exactly where it had been. "She looks happy." I handed him the water and gestured toward the couch. "Hazel said you're from Florida?" "Miami, originally. Been bouncing around since college, though. You know how it is in consulting work." My attention sharpened. "What kind of consulting?" "Financial services, risk assessment, compliance review, that sort of thing." He took a sip of water and settled into the couch like he belonged there. "What about you? Hazel mentioned you're in pharmaceuticals." "Engineering consulting. I review trial protocols and facility designs for drug companies." "Interesting. Must be good money in that." The observation felt pointed, another subtle probe into my financial situation. I was starting to understand why Hazel had been nervous about my reaction to his visit. Damon Vossel was the kind of person who gathered information as naturally as breathing, cataloging details and filing them away for future use. "It pays the bills," I said. "How do you know Hazel again?" "We dated for about a year, maybe 3 years ago. Stayed friends after things ended." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She helped me through some difficult times. Now I'm returning the favor." "What kind of difficult times?" For the first time since he'd arrived, Damon's composure slipped slightly. The question had caught him off guard, and he took a moment too long to answer. "Legal troubles," he said finally. "Nothing serious, just expensive. You know how lawyers are." I did know how lawyers were, having spent considerable time with Grant over the years. Legal troubles that were expensive but nothing serious usually meant either civil litigation or criminal charges that had been plea bargained down to something manageable. Either way, it suggested Damon's problems were more complex than a simple career transition. "Well, I hope things work out," I said. "They will. They always do." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us pretending to be at ease. Damon checked his phone several times, scrolling through messages with the focused attention of someone expecting important news. I worked on my laptop, reviewing a contract proposal while keeping one eye on my unexpected house guest. At 5:30, Hazel's key turned in the lock again. She entered with the rushed energy of someone who'd been thinking about this moment all day, her eyes immediately finding Damon on the couch. "You made it," she said, setting down her purse and moving toward him. They embraced briefly, a careful hug that lasted just long enough to be meaningful, but not so long as to be inappropriate. I watched from the kitchen table, noting the way Hazel's posture relaxed when Damon's arms went around her. "How was the drive?" she asked. "Long but uneventful. Your fiancé here has been a perfect host." Hazel looked at me with surprise and gratitude. "Really?" "Really," I said. "We've been getting acquainted." She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since yesterday's announcement. "I'm going to start dinner." Damon, you still like pasta, right? Love it. As Hazel moved around the kitchen, I gathered my laptop and work materials. I've got to head out for a meeting, I said. Should be back around 9. Business dinner? Hazel asked. Something like that. I kissed her cheek and nodded to Damon. Make yourself comfortable. We'll talk more later. Outside, I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. Through the apartment window, I could see Hazel and Damon in the kitchen, talking animatedly while she prepared dinner. Their body language was familiar, comfortable in a way that suggested more recent contact than Hazel had admitted. I pulled out my phone and texted Grant. Meeting still on? I have more questions. His response was immediate. Already working on answers. See you soon. As I drove toward Grant's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, some crucial piece of information that would explain why Damon Vossel had really come to town. The man sleeping on my couch tonight wasn't just down on his luck. He was running from something, and somehow Hazel was involved. Grant's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the historic district, with exposed brick walls and windows that overlooked the harbor. I'd been coming here for business meetings and friendly conversations for over a decade, but tonight, the familiar space felt different, more serious, more consequential. Grant was waiting with a thick folder and 2 cups of coffee, his expression grim. Damon Vossel, he said without preamble, sliding the folder across his desk. Age 36, originally from Miami. Graduated from University of Florida with a degree in finance. I opened the folder and found myself looking at a booking photo from 18 months ago. The man in the picture was definitely my houseguest, though he looked considerably less polished. Stubble, tired eyes, the hollow expression of someone whose world had just collapsed. Securities fraud, Grant continued. He was part of a scheme that manipulated clinical trial data for pharmaceutical companies. Investors lost about $12 million when the FDA discovered the falsified reports. My coffee went cold in my hands. Pharmaceutical companies. 3 of them, all working on cardiac medications. Grant leaned back in his chair. He served 18 months in federal prison, got out 4 months ago. He's still under federal monitoring, has to check in with a parole officer twice a week. I stared at the paperwork, my mind racing through the implications. Damon's background in pharmaceutical fraud, his sudden appearance in my life, Hazel's recent erratic work schedule at a clinical research firm that specialized in cardiac medication trials. There's more, Grant said. I did some digging into his recent activities. He's been living in a halfway house in Jacksonville since his release, working part-time at a grocery store. No car registered in his name, no credit cards, no bank accounts with significant balances. Then how did he drive here from Florida? Good question. I also checked hotel records in the area. No Damon Vossel registered anywhere in the past week. I set down my coffee and rubbed my temples. So either he's using a fake name, or he's been in town longer than he's letting on. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos, looking for recent pictures of Hazel. I found one from 3 weeks ago, taken at a work function she'd invited me to attend. She was standing with colleagues from the clinical research firm, smiling at the camera. Grant, I need you to look at something. I showed him the photo, pointing to a man in the background. He was partially obscured by other people, but his profile was visible. Dark hair, expensive clothes, the same confident posture I'd observed in my living room. Is that him? Grant asked. I think so. This was taken 3 weeks ago at Hazel's company party. Grant studied the image, then pulled out a magnifying glass from his desk drawer. Hard to be certain from this angle, but the build is right. Height, general appearance. So he's been in town for at least 3 weeks, probably longer, which means everything Hazel told me about his sudden arrival is a lie. It gets worse. Grant opened another file. I ran a background check on Hazel, too. Hope you don't mind, but given the circumstances. I nodded for him to continue, though part of me dreaded what he might have discovered. Her employment history is clean, but I found some interesting financial activity. She's been making regular cash deposits over the past 6 months. Small amounts, usually under $3,000, but consistent. Always in cash, always at different bank branches. How much total? Close to $40,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Hazel made decent money at the research firm, but not enough to save $40,000 in 6 months while contributing to household expenses. And why cash deposits? Why different branches? There's something else, Grant said. I have a contact at the FDA who owes me a favor. I asked him to check if there have been any irregularities reported in clinical trials involving Hazel's company. He slid another document across the desk. It was an internal FDA memo, heavily redacted but still readable enough to understand the basic content. They're investigating potential data manipulation in several cardiac medication trials. The investigation started 4 months ago, right around the time Damon was released from prison. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Grant had uncovered. My fiancée was potentially involved in the same type of pharmaceutical fraud that had sent her ex-boyfriend to prison. The man currently sleeping on my couch was a convicted felon who had lied about when he arrived in town. And somehow, I was sitting in the middle of it all, completely unaware until yesterday. What do I do? I asked. Legally? You haven't committed any crimes by letting him stay at your apartment. But if Hazel is involved in data manipulation, you need to distance yourself immediately. Your consulting business depends on your reputation with pharmaceutical companies. Any association with fraud could destroy your career. And personally? Grant's expression softened slightly. That's harder to answer. How well do you really know Hazel? The question hung in the air between us. I'd thought I knew her well enough to propose marriage, well enough to plan a future together. But the evidence spread across Grant's desk suggested I'd been living with a stranger. I need more information before I make any decisions, I said. Can you keep digging? Already on it. I've got investigators checking Damon's movements over the past few months, and my FDA contact is pulling the specific trial data that's under investigation. Should have more details by tomorrow afternoon. I gathered the documents and stood up. Thanks, Grant. I owe you. Just be careful. If they're involved in federal crimes, things could get complicated quickly. The drive home gave me time to think about my next steps. Confronting Hazel directly would likely result in denials and explanations that I couldn't verify. Confronting Damon would be equally futile. He was experienced at handling legal pressure and unlikely to admit anything incriminating. Instead, I needed to observe and gather evidence. My apartment had security cameras that I'd installed after a break-in attempt last year, but I'd never mentioned them to Hazel. They were discreet, positioned to monitor the entrances and main living areas without being obvious. If Damon and Hazel were planning something, those cameras might capture conversations or activities that would clarify their real relationship. I also needed to protect myself legally and financially. Grant could help with that, setting up documentation that would demonstrate my lack of knowledge about any illegal activities, securing my business assets, and preparing for the possibility that federal investigators might eventually come knocking. As I pulled into the parking garage beneath my building, I made a mental list of priorities. 1. Review security camera footage from the past few weeks. 2. Document all conversations with Damon and Hazel. 3. Secure my business files and client information. 4. Prepare for the possibility of ending my relationship with Hazel. The last item felt like swallowing glass, but I couldn't ignore the evidence. The woman I'd planned to marry was either involved in federal crimes or being manipulated by someone who was. Either way, my future with her was in serious jeopardy. I took the elevator up to the 8th floor and paused outside my apartment door, listening for voices inside. I could hear the television and the soft murmur of conversation, but nothing distinct enough to understand. Taking a deep breath, I put on my best casual expression and opened the door. "How was your meeting?" Hazel asked from the couch, where she sat next to Damon watching a movie. "Productive," I said, hanging up my jacket. "Sorry I'm so late." "No problem. We ordered pizza and saved you some." The domestic scene felt surreal given what I'd learned over the past few hours. Hazel looked relaxed and happy, curled up on the couch in her pajamas. Damon had changed into casual clothes and seemed perfectly at home in my living room. If I hadn't seen the federal booking photo and fraud conviction records, I might have believed this was exactly what Hazel had described, an old friend in need of temporary help. "Thanks," I said. "I'm pretty tired, though. Think I'll just grab a shower and head to bed." "Everything okay?" Hazel asked, studying my face. "Just a long day. Big presentation coming up next week." She nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. I said goodnight to both of them and headed toward the bedroom, acutely aware of their eyes following me. In the master bathroom, I turned on the shower and pulled out my phone. The security camera system could be accessed remotely through an app that I'd installed but rarely used. I scrolled through the available feeds: living room, kitchen, front entrance, and balcony. The living room camera had a clear view of the couch where Hazel and Damon were sitting. I could see them talking, but the app didn't include audio recording. Still, their body language was revealing. Hazel kept glancing toward the bedroom, clearly concerned about my reaction to the evening's developments. Damon appeared more relaxed, occasionally touching her arm or shoulder in gestures that seemed more intimate than appropriate for old friends. I scrolled back through the day's footage, watching Damon's arrival and his initial conversation with me. Seeing myself from the camera's perspective was strange. I looked calm and welcoming, giving no indication of the suspicion that had been building in my mind. But it was the footage from after I left for Grant's office that proved most interesting. Within minutes of my departure, Hazel and Damon's demeanor changed completely. They moved closer together on the couch. Their conversation became animated, and at one point, Damon pulled out a laptop and showed Hazel something on the screen that made her nod emphatically. Whatever they were planning, they were doing it in my living room while eating my food and using my Wi-Fi. I saved the relevant footage to my phone and deleted the viewing history from the app. Tomorrow, I'd start documenting everything they said and did, and when Grant's investigators finished their work, I'd have enough evidence to protect myself from whatever storm was coming. But tonight, I had to sleep in the same bed as someone who had been lying to me for months, pretending everything was normal while her convicted felon ex-boyfriend made himself comfortable on my couch. I turned off the shower and prepared for what might be the most difficult performance of my life. I woke up before dawn with the uncomfortable sensation of being watched. Hazel was still asleep beside me, but I could hear movement in the living room, footsteps, the soft sound of the refrigerator opening, water running in the kitchen sink. Damon was up early, making himself at home. I lay still for several minutes, listening to his movements and thinking about the security footage I'd reviewed last night. Whatever conversation he and Hazel had shared after I left for Grant's office, it had involved a laptop and what looked like serious planning. Today, I needed to find out what they were planning. At 6:30, I slipped out of bed and pulled on running clothes. My usual morning routine included a 3-mile loop through the neighborhood, which would give me an excuse to leave the apartment and review more security footage without arousing suspicion. Damon was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop open when I emerged from the bedroom. He looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning," he said. "Hope I didn't wake you." "I'm always up early, going for a run. Want to come along?" "Thanks, but I'm not much of a runner. Old knee injury." I nodded and grabbed my keys and phone. "Should be back in an hour. Help yourself to breakfast." Outside, I found a bench in the small park across from my building and opened the security camera app. From this angle, I could see my apartment windows while reviewing the footage from yesterday evening. The timestamp showed 7:45 p.m., about 15 minutes after I'd left for Grant's office. Hazel was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner while Damon worked on his laptop in the living room. Normal domestic activity, nothing suspicious. But at 8:10, everything changed. Damon called Hazel over to the couch and showed her something on his screen. I watched her reaction, surprise, then concern, then what looked like excitement. She sat down next to him, and they spent the next 20 minutes looking at whatever was displayed on the laptop, occasionally pointing at specific areas of the screen. At 8:35, Hazel disappeared into the bedroom and returned with her own laptop. They spent another 30 minutes working together, comparing information between the two computers. Their body language was focused, professional, like colleagues collaborating on a project. At 9:15, just before I returned home, they closed both laptops and moved apart on the couch. Hazel went to the kitchen to put away the leftover pizza, while Damon changed into the casual clothes I'd found him wearing when I got home. The whole sequence looked like a business meeting disguised as a social evening. I saved the footage and started my actual run, using the physical activity to process what I'd observed. Hazel and Damon weren't just old friends reconnecting. They were working together on something that required laptops, planning, and secrecy. Given Damon's background in pharmaceutical fraud and Hazel's position at a clinical research firm, the most likely explanation was that they were manipulating trial data. But why involve me? Why risk bringing Damon to my apartment when they could meet anywhere else in the city? The answer hit me as I rounded the corner back toward my building. They needed a base of operations, somewhere Damon could stay while conducting business in the city. A hotel would require identification and credit card records that could be traced later. My apartment provided the perfect cover, a legitimate address with no obvious connection to whatever scheme they were running. I was being used as an unwitting accomplice. Back home, I found Hazel getting ready for work, while Damon read the newspaper at the kitchen table. The scene looked perfectly normal, but now I could see the subtle signs of their deception. Hazel was dressed more carefully than usual, with the kind of attention to appearance that suggested an important day ahead. Damon's newspaper was yesterday's edition, and he wasn't really reading it. His eyes kept tracking to Hazel as she moved around the apartment. "How was your run?" Hazel asked, kissing my cheek as I headed toward the shower. "Good. Thinking about extending the route tomorrow. Maybe adding some hills." "Sounds ambitious." She gathered her purse and laptop bag. "I'll be late again tonight. We're meeting with FDA representatives about the new trial protocols." My attention sharpened. FDA representatives? Routine compliance review. Nothing exciting. But her voice had that same flat tone she'd used when discussing her work projects, the tone that meant she couldn't or wouldn't provide details. After she left, I showered and dressed for a day of working from home. Damon was still at the kitchen table when I emerged, but now he was working on his laptop again. "Busy day?" I asked, making coffee. "Catching up on some consulting work. Remote projects. You know how it is." I nodded and settled at the opposite end of the table with my own laptop. For the next 2 hours, we worked in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging small talk about the weather or current events. But I was hyper-aware of his presence, noting the websites he visited, mostly financial news and industry publications, and the way he positioned his screen to prevent me from seeing specific content. At 11 o'clock, my phone rang. Grant's name appeared on the display. "Excuse me," I said to Damon. "Business call." I stepped onto the balcony and closed the sliding door behind me. "What did you find?" I asked without preamble. "More than I expected," Grant said. "My FDA contact came through with some interesting information. 3 clinical trials at Hazel's company are under active investigation for data manipulation. All 3 involve cardiac medications, and all 3 show the same pattern of falsified safety reports." The same pattern as Damon's previous fraud case? Identical methodology. Whoever is doing this learned from his techniques. I looked through the balcony door at Damon, still working at my kitchen table. What about his movements over the past few months? That's where it gets interesting. He was released to a halfway house in Jacksonville, but he's been traveling regularly under a supervised release program for job interviews. Except most of those job interviews were in cities where pharmaceutical companies are conducting clinical trials, including here. He's been in town at least 6 times over the past 4 months, always for 2 or 3 days, always staying at different cheap motels on the outskirts of the city. So when Hazel said he just arrived yesterday, she was lying. He's been coming here regularly, probably meeting with her each time. I felt a cold certainty settling in my stomach. Grant, I think they're planning something big. Last night they spent over an hour working together on their laptops, and today Hazel mentioned meeting with FDA representatives. That could be significant. If they're trying to stay ahead of the investigation, they might be planning to destroy evidence or manipulate the remaining data before the FDA completes their review. What should I do? Document everything. Conversations, activities, anything that might be relevant later. And Rylan, start thinking about an exit strategy. If this goes bad, you don't want to be anywhere near the fallout. After hanging up, I stood on the balcony for several minutes, looking out at the harbor and thinking about the life I'd built over the past 3 years. My consulting business, my reputation in the pharmaceutical industry, my relationship with Hazel, all of it was at risk because of decisions other people had made without my knowledge. But I wasn't helpless. I had information they didn't know I possessed, resources they weren't aware of, and the advantage of appearing completely naive about their activities. It was time to start planning my own strategy. I went back inside to find Damon closing his laptop and checking his phone. I need to step out for a few hours, he said, meeting with a potential client downtown. Need directions anywhere? Thanks, but I know the city pretty well. Another lie. According to Grant's research, Damon had been visiting regularly for months. He probably knew the city better than I did at this point. I'll probably be here when you get back, I said, working on a big presentation for next week. After he left, I immediately pulled up the security camera app and began reviewing footage from the past week. If Damon and Hazel had been meeting regularly, there might be evidence of their previous encounters. It took me an hour to find what I was looking for, but the evidence was damning. 5 days ago, while I was traveling for a client meeting in Portland, Hazel had brought Damon to the apartment. The timestamp showed them arriving together at 2:30 in the afternoon and staying until nearly midnight. They'd spent the entire evening working together, spreading documents across my dining room table and taking turns at their laptops. At one point, Hazel had produced a stack of papers from her work bag, papers that looked suspiciously like clinical trial reports based on their official formatting and the way she and Damon studied them. But the most revealing moment came at 9:45 p.m. when Hazel's phone rang. She answered it, spoke briefly, then handed the phone to Damon. He talked for several minutes, taking notes while listening to whoever was on the other end of the call. When the call ended, they'd packed up their materials and spent another hour at their laptops, working with the focused intensity of people racing against a deadline. I saved the footage and continued searching through previous days. The pattern became clear quickly. Every time I traveled for business, Hazel brought Damon to the apartment. They'd been using my home as their headquarters for months, planning and executing whatever scheme they were running while I was conveniently out of town. My phone buzzed with a text from Hazel. Meeting running late. Won't be home until after 10. Order dinner for yourself and Damon. I stared at the message, noting the casual way she'd included Damon in her instructions, like he was a permanent resident rather than a temporary guest. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. This is Damon. Hazel gave me your number. My meeting is running late too. Might not be back until midnight. Thanks for understanding. Suddenly, I was alone in my apartment with access to whatever materials they might have left behind. If they were careless enough to leave evidence lying around, this could be my chance to understand the full scope of their operation. I started with Damon's duffel bag, which he'd left in the living room closet. Inside, I found clothes, toiletries, and a manila folder containing documents that made my heart race. Bank statements showing cash deposits that matched the pattern Grant had identified in Hazel's accounts. Copies of clinical trial reports from pharmaceutical companies across the Southeast, and most damning of all, a list of FDA investigators with notes about their areas of focus and investigation timelines. Damon and Hazel weren't just manipulating trial data, they were staying ahead of federal investigators by monitoring the investigation itself. I photographed everything with my phone, being careful to return each item to its exact position in the bag. Then I searched the rest of the apartment for anything else they might have hidden. In Hazel's laptop bag, I found a USB drive that she'd tucked into a side pocket. When I plugged it into my computer, it contained dozens of files with names like Trial 47, Revised Safety Data, and FDA Compliance Alternative Reporting. I copied everything to my own secure drive and returned the USB to its hiding place. By the time I finished my search, I had enough evidence to understand exactly what Hazel and Damon were doing. They were part of a larger network that manipulated clinical trial data for pharmaceutical companies, falsifying safety reports to help get medications approved faster. The FDA investigation was closing in, but they were using inside information to stay one step ahead of the investigators, and they were using my apartment and my unwitting cooperation as cover for their criminal enterprise. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, and made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop being a victim and start being the engineer of their downfall. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for war. First, I called Grant and arranged an emergency meeting for early the next morning. The evidence I'd discovered needed to be documented properly and turned over to federal investigators, but I wanted to make sure my own legal position was protected before taking that step. Second, I researched the FDA investigators whose names appeared on Damon's list. A few phone calls to industry contacts gave me the information I needed. These were serious federal agents with extensive experience in pharmaceutical fraud cases. When they eventually arrested Hazel and Damon, the charges would be substantial. Third, I began planning my exit strategy. My consulting business was portable. Most of my clients were accustomed to remote work, and I could relocate anywhere in the country without losing income. My apartment was my most valuable asset, but it was also contaminated by association with federal crimes. I needed to distance myself from both the property and the relationship before the investigation became public. But first, I had to make sure Hazel and Damon didn't suspect what I'd discovered. At 9:30, I ordered Chinese food for 3 people and set the table as if expecting both of them home soon. I also pulled up a pharmaceutical engineering presentation on my laptop and scattered related documents around the kitchen table, creating the appearance of someone absorbed in legitimate work. Hazel arrived at 10:15, looking tired and stressed. She kissed my cheek absently and headed straight for the refrigerator. "How was the FDA meeting?" I asked. "Tedious. Lots of paperwork and compliance questions." She opened a bottle of wine and poured herself a large glass. "Where's Damon?" "Still at his meeting, I think. He texted earlier saying he'd be late." She nodded and took a long sip of wine. "I'm exhausted. Think I'll just grab a shower and go to bed." "I ordered Chinese food. Want me to save you some?" "Thanks, but I'm not really hungry." I watched her disappear into the bedroom, noting the way she avoided eye contact and the tension in her shoulders. Whatever had happened at her meeting today, it hadn't gone well. Damon returned at 11:40, looking equally stressed. His usual confident demeanor was strained, and he kept checking his phone as if expecting important news. "How was your meeting?" I asked. "Complicated. Some potential regulatory issues with the client's business model." He sat down heavily on the couch. "Is Hazel around?" "Already asleep. Long day at work." He nodded, but I could see disappointment in his expression. Whatever they needed to discuss would have to wait until tomorrow. I saved you some dinner, I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. Thanks. I appreciate everything you're doing, Rylan. I know this situation isn't ideal. For a moment, his facade slipped, and I caught a glimpse of genuine emotion. Guilt, maybe, or regret about the deception he was perpetrating. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his usual practiced charm. No problem, I said. We've all been in tough spots. I went to bed shortly after midnight, leaving Damon alone in the living room with his laptop and his worries. Through the thin walls, I could hear him making phone calls in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out specific words. The next morning, I woke early and slipped out of the apartment before either Hazel or Damon were awake. Grant was waiting in his office with coffee and a grim expression. "Show me what you found," he said. I laid out the photographs and copied files, explaining how I'd discovered each piece of evidence. Grant reviewed everything methodically, occasionally stopping to make notes or ask clarifying questions. "This is substantial," he said finally. "Enough to prove conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. But we need to be careful about how we proceed." "What do you mean?" "You obtained this evidence by searching their personal belongings without consent. In some circumstances, that could make it inadmissible in court. We need to make sure federal investigators can build their own case without relying solely on your discoveries." "So, what do we do?" "We give them enough information to start their own investigation, but we don't hand over the evidence directly. Anonymous tips, suggestions about where to look, that sort of thing." Grant pulled out a legal pad and began drafting a strategy. "First, we document your complete lack of knowledge about their activities prior to this week. Second, we establish that you discovered their deception through normal domestic activities, noticing inconsistencies in their stories, finding materials they left in plain sight. Third, we create a timeline showing when you became suspicious and what steps you took to protect yourself. And then we get you out of that apartment and away from both of them before the federal investigation becomes public. If you're living there when they get arrested, you'll be treated as a potential co-conspirator until proven otherwise." The next 2 hours were spent preparing documents and planning my exit strategy. Grant would handle the legal aspects, contacting federal investigators and ensuring my cooperation was properly documented. I would handle the practical aspects, securing my business assets, finding temporary housing, and extracting myself from the situation without alerting Hazel or Damon to my knowledge of their crimes. "How long do I have?" I asked. "Based on the timeline in their documents, probably less than a week. They're planning something significant, and they're running out of time to stay ahead of the investigation." I returned home to find Hazel and Damon sitting at the kitchen table with their laptops open, working together in the same focused way I'd observed on the security cameras. They looked up when I entered, and I caught a brief moment of tension before their expression shifted to casual friendliness. "Morning meeting?" I asked. "Just catching up on some work stuff," Hazel said. "How was your run?" "Good. Thinking about entering a 10K next month." It was a lie. I hadn't been running, and I had no intention of being in the city next month. But it reinforced the impression that I was focused on normal, mundane concerns rather than federal crimes. I made coffee and settled at the opposite end of the table with my own laptop, pretending to work on client projects while actually monitoring their activities. They were being more careful today, keeping their voices low and positioning their screens away from my line of sight. But their body language told a story of increasing urgency and stress. At noon, Hazel's phone rang. She stepped onto the balcony to take the call, leaving Damon and me alone in the kitchen. "Everything okay?" I asked. "You both seem a little stressed today." "Just work pressure," he said. "You know how it is with consulting projects. Everything always seems urgent to the client." Through the balcony door, I could see Hazel pacing while she talked, her free hand gesturing emphatically. Whatever news she was receiving, it wasn't good. She came back inside with a pale face and shaky hands. "I have to go into work," she said to Damon. They moved up the deadline. "How much time do we have?" 2 days, maybe 3. They exchanged a look, loaded with meaning, then quickly packed up their laptops. Within 15 minutes, both of them had left the apartment, claiming urgent business that would keep them busy for the rest of the day. I waited until I was certain they were gone, then called Grant. "They're accelerating their timeline," I said. "Whatever they're planning, it's happening within the next few days. Then we need to move faster, too. Can you be out of that apartment by tomorrow night? If I have to be, you have to be. I'm contacting the federal investigators this afternoon. Once they start surveillance, anyone in that apartment becomes a person of interest." After hanging up, I began the process of extracting myself from the life I'd built with Hazel. I packed essential clothes and documents into a suitcase, transferred important business files to secure cloud storage, and made arrangements to work remotely from a hotel across town. The hardest part was writing the letter I'd leave for Hazel. It needed to explain my sudden departure without revealing what I knew about her criminal activities. Grant had advised me to keep it simple: a work emergency that required immediate travel, apologies for the short notice, promises to call when I could. But as I sat at my kitchen table, trying to find words that would end our 2-year relationship without destroying her before federal agents had a chance to arrest her, I felt the weight of everything I was losing. The apartment where we'd planned our future together, the engagement ring that still sat in her jewelry box, the trust I'd placed in someone who had been systematically betraying me for months. By tomorrow night, all of it would be gone, and I'd be starting over in a new city with nothing but my business and the knowledge that the woman I'd planned to marry was a federal criminal. But as I sealed the letter in an envelope with Hazel's name on it, I realized something else. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. The engineer was about to complete his most important blueprint, the one that would build him a future free from lies, fraud, and false promises. I spent my last night in the apartment documenting everything. Using the security camera system, I compiled a comprehensive video record of Hazel and Damon's activities over the past week. Their planning sessions, their urgent phone calls, their obvious deception about the nature of their relationship and business activities. I saved everything to encrypted drives and uploaded copies to secure cloud storage that only Grant could access. I also prepared a detailed timeline of my own discoveries, carefully noting when I first became suspicious and what evidence I'd found. Grant's investigators would need to understand exactly what I knew and when I knew it, both to establish my innocence and to build their case against Hazel and Damon. At 3 a.m, I heard Hazel's key in the lock. She slipped into the apartment quietly, assuming I was asleep, and went straight to the living room where she spent nearly an hour on her laptop. Through the bedroom door, I could hear her typing rapidly and making hushed phone calls. Whatever deadline they were racing toward, it was getting closer. I lay in bed, listening to the woman I'd planned to marry conduct what was probably federal conspiracy in my living room, and felt nothing but cold determination. She'd made her choices. Now I was making mine. At 7 a.m., I got up and went through my normal morning routine: shower, coffee, check email, review the day's work schedule. Hazel was still asleep, exhausted from her late-night criminal activities. I left the letter on the kitchen table where she'd find it, grabbed my suitcase and laptop bag, and walked out of my apartment for the last time. The letter was brief and professional. Hazel, emergency client situation requires immediate travel to Seattle. We'll be gone at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Sorry for the short notice. We'll call when I can. Take care of yourself. Rylan. No mention of Damon, no questions about her recent behavior, no indication that I suspected anything unusual. Just a simple business trip that would remove me from whatever was about to happen. I checked into a hotel across town and called Grant from the room. "I'm out," I said. Letter left, apartment empty except for them. Good timing. Federal agents are meeting with me this afternoon. They'll probably start surveillance tonight. How long before arrests? Days, not weeks. They've been building this case for months, and your information filled in the missing pieces. Once they confirm the evidence you discovered, they'll move quickly. I spent the rest of the day setting up my temporary office and contacting clients about my sudden relocation. Most were understanding. Consulting work often required flexibility, and I'd built a reputation for reliability over the years. The Seattle story would hold long enough for me to decide where to relocate permanently. At 6 p.m., Grant called with an update. Federal agents confirmed everything you found. They already had surveillance on Damon from his parole monitoring, and they've been tracking the financial irregularities at Hazel's company for weeks. Your evidence just connected all the dots. When will they move? Tomorrow night. Hazel and Damon are planning to destroy evidence and flee the city this weekend. Federal agents will arrest them before they get the chance. I hung up and stood at my hotel window, looking out at the city where I'd built my life and career. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Hazel would be in federal custody, Damon would be back in prison, and I'd be free to start over wherever I chose. But first, I had one more task to complete. I opened my laptop and began writing a detailed report of everything that had happened, from Hazel's first suspicious behavior to my discovery of their criminal conspiracy. The report would serve multiple purposes: documentation for federal investigators, protection for my business reputation, and a record of lessons learned from the most difficult period of my life. As I wrote, I realized that Hazel's betrayal had revealed something important about my own character. I'd spent 2 years trusting someone who was systematically deceiving me, ignoring warning signs and accepting explanations that should have raised more questions. But when I finally recognized the truth, I'd acted decisively to protect myself and ensure justice was served. The same analytical skills that made me successful in pharmaceutical engineering had helped me uncover a federal conspiracy and extract myself before suffering serious consequences. The next evening, I was having dinner in the hotel restaurant when Grant called. "It's over," he said. "Federal agents arrested both of them an hour ago. Charges include conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. They found everything you documented, plus additional evidence that confirms a multi-state operation." I set down my fork, surprised by the wave of relief that washed over me. What happens now? They'll be held without bail pending trial. The evidence is overwhelming, so plea negotiations will probably start within a few weeks. Your apartment is sealed as a crime scene, but you should be able to recover your personal belongings within a month. And my involvement? You're listed as a cooperating witness who provided crucial information. No charges, no suspicion of criminal activity. Your reputation is protected. After hanging up, I sat in the restaurant for a long time, processing the end of my relationship with Hazel and the beginning of whatever came next. The woman I'd planned to marry was facing decades in federal prison. The apartment where we'd lived together was now evidence in a criminal case. The future we'd discussed was gone, replaced by possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. But for the first time in months, I felt like myself again, clear-headed, decisive, in control of my own destiny. Over the next week, I made arrangements to relocate permanently to Seattle, where several pharmaceutical companies had offered me consulting contracts. The distance from the East Coast would help me avoid media attention from the trial, and the work would be challenging enough to keep me focused on rebuilding my career. I also started therapy, recognizing that I needed professional help, processing the betrayal and learning to trust my instincts in future relationships. The therapist helped me understand that intelligent, successful people can still be manipulated by skilled criminals, and that recognizing deception quickly is a skill that can be developed with practice. 6 months later, I was established in Seattle with a thriving consulting practice and a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound. Grant kept me updated on the legal proceedings. Hazel and Damon had both accepted plea agreements and received substantial prison sentences. The pharmaceutical companies involved in their fraud scheme faced massive fines and regulatory sanctions. I never spoke to Hazel again, though she wrote me several letters from prison that I returned unopened. Whatever apologies or explanations she wanted to offer, I wasn't interested in hearing them. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. The experience taught me that trust is earned through consistent actions over time, not granted based on promises or appearances. It also taught me that my analytical skills, the same abilities that made me successful in engineering, were equally valuable in protecting myself from people who would exploit my trusting nature. Most importantly, it taught me that starting over isn't a failure. It's an opportunity to build something better with the wisdom gained from previous mistakes. The blueprint for my new life was simple. Professional success based on competence and integrity, personal relationships built on mutual respect and transparency, and the confidence that comes from knowing I could handle whatever challenges might arise. As I stood on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset over the Sound, I realized that Hazel and Damon had actually done me a favor. By forcing me to confront their deception and take decisive action to protect myself, they'd helped me discover strengths I didn't know I possessed. The engineer's last blueprint was complete, and it was better than anything I'd designed before.